The story begins with a couple, eager and full of excitement, moving into a new home. It wasn't a grand mansion, but it was theirs. A fresh start in a cozy house nestled in a quiet, suburban neighborhood. The house, though old, had a certain charm that spoke to them. It wasn't too big, just enough for the two of them to begin a new chapter in their lives. The rooms were spacious, with high ceilings and large windows that let in the sunlight, making the place feel open and welcoming. Even though it was a little run down, with peeling paint and creaky floorboards, they didn't mind. They saw it as a project, something they could fix together. There was a sense of comfort in the idea of turning this house into their home. The couple spent their first day unpacking, arranging their belongings, and dreaming about how they would transform the space. It was the beginning of something beautiful, or so they thought. The house, with all its old-fashioned quirks, seemed to welcome them with open arms, its gentle creaks and groans part of the house's character. They didn't think much of the odd noises, the ones that came from the walls or floorboards. They were just part of living in an old house, they reasoned. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the rooms, the couple settled down in the living room, feeling at ease in their new surroundings. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. There was a sense of calm in the air, the kind of tranquility that only comes when you're finally home. But as the night drew closer, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything they could pinpoint at first, just a vague unease that seemed to hover in the background. They brushed it off, telling themselves it was just nerves, the natural feeling of being in a new place. They went to bed that night, hopeful for the future, unaware that the house they'd just moved into was far from the peaceful retreat they had imagined. It was a house with a history, one that had seen things, heard things, and perhaps even held onto things that it wasn't ready to let go of. Little did the couple know, as they drifted off to sleep, the house was already beginning to show its true nature. The quiet tapping they heard in the dead of night was just the beginning. It was a warning, a sign that the house was alive in its own way, alive with something ancient, something that had been waiting for them to arrive. The house had secrets, and as they would soon discover, those secrets were darker than they could ever have imagined. The couple's new home was about to become a prison, and they were already trapped inside, though they didn't know it yet. The first night in the house arrived quietly, with the stillness of unfamiliar surroundings settling over every room. Darkness wrapped itself around the walls, and the only sound was the wind brushing against the windows. After a long day of unpacking, the couple climbed into bed, their bodies tired but their minds restless. As sleep began to take hold, a faint sound broke the silence, a soft, repetitive tapping that echoed through the hallway just beyond their bedroom door. At first it was easy to dismiss. Perhaps it was the old pipes, or maybe a branch brushing against the windowpane. The man opened one eye, listened for a few seconds, and shrugged it off. His partner stirred slightly but said nothing. They pulled the blanket tighter and closed their eyes once more. Then the sound returned, this time louder. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm was slow and steady, unnatural in its timing. It no longer sounded like a branch or a pipe. It resembled knuckles tapping gently on wood. A growing tension began to fill the room, a quiet pressure that made the air feel thicker. Still, the couple told themselves it had to be something simple, just an old house creaking in the night. But the tapping grew louder with each passing minute, echoing through the wooden walls, moving as if traveling from one part of the house to another. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably human. The creaks on the floorboards followed a pattern, pacing back and forth outside their door. The man sat up in bed, holding his breath, his ears straining to pick up the direction of the noise. The footsteps stopped, and a long silence fell. Then came a sound that made their blood run cold. The doorknob rattled gently, as though someone was testing it from the other side. Neither dared to move. The woman's eyes met her partner's, wide with fear, lips parted but no words coming out. Seconds felt like minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet again. No more tapping, no more footsteps. Only the sound of their own breathing remained. The man slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the door, pressing his ear against the wood. Nothing. He slowly turned the knob and opened it. The hallway stood empty, lit only by the faint glow of the nightlight from the bathroom. The silence was deafening. He walked out slowly, checked each room, every corner. No intruder, no sign of anyone. Everything was exactly as they had left it, but the air felt different now, heavy, tense, as though the house had exhaled after holding its breath. They returned to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The night dragged on, long and unsettling. Whatever had caused the noise was gone for now, but something inside that house had stirred. The walls were listening, something had awakened, and it wasn't going back to sleep. Morning light crept through the curtains, bringing a fragile sense of normalcy after the disturbing events of the previous night. The man, still unsettled, decided to explore the basement, a part of the house neither he nor his partner had dared to enter since moving in. The door to the basement stood in the far corner of the kitchen, almost forgotten. Its old wooden frame looked more worn than the rest of the house, as though it had stood untouched for years. The handle, cold and rusted, resisted slightly before giving way with a low creak. A heavy, musty smell rose from the stairs as the door swung open. Grabbing a flashlight, he stepped onto the first stair, its wood groaning under his weight. Each step downward felt like a descent into something ancient, a part of the house that had remained hidden for too long. The air grew colder with each step, not the kind of cold that came from a draft or lack of insulation, but a deep, unsettling chill that seemed to reach beneath the skin. Dust floated in the beam of the flashlight, dancing like tiny ghosts in the stale air. The basement stretched out in darkness, lined with shelves that held forgotten tools, rusted metal objects, and crumbling cardboard boxes. Cobwebs draped from the ceiling like curtains, and the stone walls seemed to breathe, as if the house was alive down here. The floor was uneven and cracked, and each footstep echoed far too loud, as though something was listening. Then, at the far end of the basement, something strange caught his eye. A small wooden door, almost hidden behind an old wardrobe. The flashlight's beam revealed its unusual size and design. It looked much older than the rest of the basement, and it hadn't been mentioned in any of the house documents. There were no signs that it was meant to be opened. No knob, no handle, only a small keyhole and faint markings carved into the frame. Something about it felt deeply wrong, as if it wasn't meant to be found. But curiosity began to push logic aside. With hesitant fingers, he touched the door, expecting it to be locked. Instead, it creaked open on its own, slowly, without resistance. Inside was a tiny room with stone walls and a dirt floor. The smell of decay hung heavy in the air. At the center sat an old chair, facing a wall covered in strange symbols. The symbols were dark, almost black, and looked as though they had been drawn with something far more sinister than ink. They pulsed faintly, almost like they were breathing with him. A sudden wave of nausea hit, followed by an overwhelming sense of being watched. The room, though empty, felt crowded. He backed away, heart pounding, and turned to leave. The door slammed shut behind him, making him jump. Panic rising, he rushed up the stairs, not daring to look back. Whatever had been waiting in that hidden room had seen him now, and it wasn't going to forget. The days that followed grew heavier with dread, as if the house itself had begun to breathe more loudly, more angrily. Strange occurrences became frequent, mirrors fogged up with handprints that didn't match either of theirs, lights flickered even with brand new bulbs, and faint whispers echoed in rooms that were supposed to be empty. The man, haunted by what he had seen in the hidden basement room, avoided speaking of it, afraid that giving it words might give it more power. But the silence between the couple only added to the tension. One evening, while cleaning the attic in search of old paint supplies, the woman discovered an aged trunk tucked away behind a broken dresser. The trunk was covered in dust and bound in thick leather straps. Its lock, long rusted, crumbled away with the slightest pressure. Inside lay a collection of old journals, photographs, and brittle newspaper clippings, each page stained yellow with time, the ink faded but still legible. The journals belonged to the house's previous owner, a man named Elias Granger, who had vanished without a trace nearly 4 decades ago. His writings started off normal, daily observations, home improvement notes, but slowly grew darker with each page. He wrote of whispers in the walls, of eyes watching from the shadows, of dreams that bled into waking life. The final entries were disturbing, rambling about a door that should never be opened, and a presence that feeds on memory and fear. He claimed the house was alive, feeding off anyone who stayed too long, twisting their minds, stealing pieces of their soul. One photograph in particular stood out, a black and white image of the basement wall, clearly showing the strange door now hidden behind the wardrobe. Scrawled beneath it were the words, "Keep it shut. Do not let it speak." A chill settled in the woman's spine as she read those words again and again. She closed the trunk and hurried downstairs, calling out for her partner, but the house remained eerily quiet. The silence was different this time. It wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. A shadow moved across the hallway, but when she turned, nothing was there. Lights began to flicker again, but this time they didn't return. Darkness swallowed the house, broken only by the dim red glow of the old oven clock. Footsteps echoed from above, though no one had gone upstairs. The air grew colder, thick with unseen tension. The couple found themselves together in the living room, both pale, both silent, both aware that something was terribly wrong. Neither had to say it aloud. They felt it. The house was changing. Something had been disturbed, something old, something angry. And it was no longer hiding in the shadows. It was moving, watching, waiting. Whatever had been trapped behind that door had begun to seep into the rest of the house, and the real haunting had only just begun. That night brought no sleep. The house had grown colder, the walls seemed to hum with low, steady vibrations, and every shadow stretched a little longer than it should have. Time itself felt strange, as though the minutes were slowing, dragging the night into something endless. The man paced the hallway while the woman sat curled on the couch, clutching the old journal she had found. Every now and then they heard faint knocking from inside the walls, never loud, just soft enough to make it worse. Then came the voices. Whispered words that didn't belong to any language either of them understood, echoing softly from empty rooms. One moment they were faint, the next they were right behind the ears, as if spoken inches away. When they tried to speak, the voices grew louder, like a warning. Lights turned on by themselves, then exploded in sparks. The television flickered, showing static before revealing brief flashes of unknown symbols, the same ones from the basement wall. And then the dreams began. Each time their eyes closed, the same nightmare returned. Endless halls. A dark figure watching from the end. A door that pulsed like a heartbeat. The woman began to lose her sense of time. Morning and night blended together. The man caught himself staring at the walls for hours, unable to remember what he had been thinking about. Objects moved when no one was near. Chairs turned to face walls, drawers opened and emptied themselves, and the basement door creaked open every evening at the same time, 9:13 p.m. One night, the couple decided to confront it. Not out of bravery, but because they knew whatever was happening wouldn't stop until something was done. With shaking hands and a single flashlight, they made their way to the basement. The air grew thick with a stench of earth and rot. The flashlight flickered with every step. When they reached the hidden room, the strange door was wide open. Inside, the symbols on the wall now glowed faintly, pulsing like veins under skin. The old chair had been moved, turned toward them as if someone had been waiting, and then came the sound, breathing, not from the couple, but from something unseen. Heavy, raspy, unnatural, it filled the small room. Cold air rushed out, surrounding them, making it hard to breathe. The woman dropped the flashlight, and it rolled across the floor, casting wild shadows. In those shadows, something moved, a shape that didn't belong to anything human. The walls trembled. A voice echoed from inside the room, low and deep, not made by vocal cords, but something older, something that had never been alive in the way people understand life. It spoke only one word: stay. The basement door slammed shut behind them, locking tight. Panic rose, but the couple knew the truth in that moment. Leaving was no longer a choice. The house had claimed them, and whatever lived in the darkness wanted them to remain, forever. The days that followed were not truly days anymore. Light barely touched the windows, and when it did, it felt wrong, dull, gray, and heavy, like it had been filtered through something unnatural. The couple no longer spoke in full sentences. Their minds felt foggy, as if thoughts slipped away the moment they were formed. The house had begun to twist their sense of reality. Walls seemed to shift when backs were turned, hallways stretched longer, and rooms appeared where none had been before. The mirrors no longer reflected the truth. Sometimes they showed the couple standing still, staring straight ahead, even when they were nowhere near. Sometimes the reflections smiled, even when no smiles were given. Food spoiled within minutes. Water ran black, thick, and slow. Every attempt to leave ended at the same spot. The front door opened to endless darkness, a void where the outside world should have been. Birds no longer sang near the house. No cars passed by. It was as if the world beyond the property line had ceased to exist entirely. The journal found in the attic became their only guide. Its last pages, written in shaky, frantic handwriting, described what Elias Granger had called the turning the moment the house stopped pretending to be a home and began showing its true self. He had described it perfectly. The hallucinations, the shifting architecture, the whispers, the hunger. There was one passage that stood out above all others. The house does not haunt, it consumes, and it must be fed. This truth hit like ice. It had never been a question of exorcising something evil or escaping it. The house itself was the evil. Alive, ancient, and always hungry. Its presence wasn't just in the walls. It was the walls, the ceilings, the air, the very ground beneath. One night, as the clock hit 9:13, the basement door swung open again, not with force, but with invitation. A dull, red glow pulsed from below. The couple stood frozen, caught between the instinct to run and the terrifying knowledge that there was nowhere left to run to. The woman, still holding the journal, stepped forward. A memory stirred, one final note scribbled in the margin. It only sleeps when offered something it wants. But what did it want? It had already taken their peace, their sanity, and their time. Then came the sound again, breathing, deep and wet, from the bottom of the stairs. The man grabbed a rusted crowbar from the hallway, not as a weapon, but as something to hold, something solid in a world that no longer obeyed rules. Together, they descended. The light dimmed behind them, swallowed by the void. The hidden room was different now, larger. The symbols on the wall no longer pulsed. They glowed steadily, like open eyes watching their return. In the center stood a figure. Not quite human, not fully formed. Its face was blurry, shifting constantly as if trying to become familiar. It didn't move. It only waited, and the house seemed to wait with it, breathing through the walls. The silence that followed was unlike any silence before it, thick, complete, and deeply final. The house stood still, every creaking floorboard now motionless, every whisper gone, as though it had finally fallen into a long, satisfied sleep. In the center of the basement, the man's body lay perfectly still, eyes gently closed, face softened into calm. The shadows that had once twisted and danced across the walls faded into nothing, retreating into the cracks of the room like water sinking into dry ground. The woman knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she touched his cheek, still warm but already distant. She whispered his name again and again, but no sound ever came back. Her voice broke against the silence like waves against stone, powerless and empty. The figure that had stood in the room, the shifting, watching thing, was gone now. Not vanished in a sudden flash, but melted slowly, dissolved into the very walls, as if it had never been a separate being at all. The glow of the symbols dimmed until only faint etchings remained on the cold stone. Everything that had once pulsed with life, or something like it, was now still. A single beam of light shone through the open basement door above, brighter than any light that had touched the house in days. It fell across the man's chest, illuminating him like a final farewell. The woman stayed there for what felt like hours, her tears falling silently. Then, with the journal pressed tightly to her chest, she stood. Her steps were slow, heavy with grief, but steady. As she climbed the stairs, the air grew warmer. The house, once filled with icy breath and whispers, now breathed nothing at all. Furniture sat still, untouched. The walls no longer shifted. Outside the front window, the trees swayed gently in a breeze that finally felt real again. Somewhere down the road, a bird chirped. A car passed. The world had returned, unaware of what had been demanded to bring it back. The woman paused at the front door. For a long time she stared at the brass handle, remembering how it had once led to a void of endless darkness. Now sunlight streamed through the cracks, and the scent of earth and spring filled the air beyond. She stepped out slowly, the first time her feet had touched the outside since the nightmare began. Behind her, the house remained silent, its windows watching without eyes, its doors closed, its hunger buried deep once more. As she walked down the path, never looking back, the house stood like any other on the street, quiet, unassuming, harmless. But the journal in her hands told a different story. Someday it would wake again. It always did. And when that door in the basement opened at 9:13 p.m., someone else would answer its call. Because the house was not haunted, it was alive, and it remembered everything.